Are you a struggling Broadway producer? Is your latest stage production being rated by the NYPD every other Tuesday? Have angry moral reformers called your work obscene? Dangerous? Spiritually corrosive? Or worst of all, experimental theater? Then you may qualify for the all-new Hollywood Clean Cash Starter Kit at TM. From the fine people at Madden Enterprises, Tammany Hall, and absolutely legitimate Financial Services Incorporated. Inside every starter kit you'll receive one heavily inflated theater budget, 3 judges already on payroll, 2 union guys named Frankie the Pipe and Little Sal, a complimentary briefcase filled with mysteriously untraceable cash, and our patented press management system. That's right. With our revolutionary press management technology, newspaper critics suddenly become much more understanding after polite conversations in dimly lit speakeasies. Side effects may include mysteriously positive reviews, disappearing editorials, selective moral outrage, and sudden career changes among district attorneys. But wait, there's more. Order now and we'll throw in the Broadway Padlock Protection Package, absolutely free. Police raid your theater? No problem. Our trained legal specialists immediately provide bail money, replacement accountants, emergency shell corporations, and morally flexible bookkeeping personnel. Why suffer the crushing weight of artistic censorship alone when organized crime can monetize your rebellion for you? Still not convinced? Listen to these real customer testimonials. Angie, before the Hollywood Clean Cash Starter Kit, I was just another struggling actress. Now I'm a fully weaponized commercial asset with offshore accounting structures. Tony from Staten Island. The critics hated my show until somebody politely explained the consequences. Johnny D, I asked for investors. They sent me 6 armed guys from Hell's Kitchen, 5 stars. And introducing our newest expansion pack, the Breen Office Survival Kit, now featuring industrial strength double entendre, censorship-proof dialogue, Catholic boycott insurance, and a complimentary dictionary explaining what the hell malicious compliance means. Remember, if the audience can't tell whether your movie is dirty, the censors can't arrest you for it. Probably. So don't wait. Call now and receive a free bonus copy of Accounting for Bootleggers, Turning Federal Crimes into Taxable Revenue Since 1926. Operators are standing by, most of them legally. The Hollywood Clean Cash Starter Kit. Because behind every great Hollywood legend, there's usually a guy with a gun and an accounting ledger. Madden Enterprises is not responsible for federal indictments, labor racketeering charges, studio collapses, censorship crusades, missing journalists, phantom expenses, church boycotts, suspicious union activity, tax fraud investigations, exploding automobiles, or sudden conversations with the FBI. Please consult your local attorney before laundering theatrical revenue through organized crime syndicates. Offer not valid in New Jersey. The following documentary is intended for historical, educational, and existentially uncomfortable purposes only. Any resemblance between organized crime, corrupt politicians, media manipulation, financial laundering operations, and the modern entertainment industry is obviously just a gigantic coincidence. Please do not attempt to build a Hollywood empire using bootleg cash, Broadway obscenity trials, union extortion rackets, or mob-backed theater productions. The lawyers get very cranky about that sort of thing. This documentary contains discussions of organized crime, political corruption, censorship, media intimidation, federal investigations, manipulated justice systems, studio exploitation, and enough moral hypocrisy to power Manhattan for a century. Viewer discretion is advised. Remember, Hollywood didn't invent illusion, it industrialized it. Now let's get into it.
Mae West, the Hollywood empire built by the Mafia. A Pizzaverse Studios documentary. A Palermo Productions original. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DiPrio. Research and historical breakdown by Pizzaverse Archives. Special thanks. 2. The old Broadway underworld, the ghosts of Prohibition, and every studio executive who pretended not to notice the Mafia sitting in the lobby. History celebrates Mae West as an untouchable feminist icon, the woman who shattered censorship, the queen who conquered Hollywood through sheer talent and rebellion. But that version of the story leaves out the gunman. It leaves out the bootleg cash. It leaves out the syndicate accountants, the political fixers, the judges on payroll, and the brutal underworld infrastructure operating silently beneath the Broadway lights. Because Mae West didn't just rise through Hollywood. She rose through one of the largest money laundering operations of the Prohibition-era. And the men funding her ascent weren't studio executives. They were gangsters. This is the story Hollywood never wanted attached to her legacy. The story of Owney Madden, the New York underworld, the Broadway laundering machine, the collapse of the studio system, and the brutal transactional reality hiding behind America's golden age of entertainment. This is the real empire behind Mae West. The perfect laundromat. History celebrates Mae West as an independent queen who single-handedly shattered Hollywood's censorship laws. But that arrogance was actually measured in suitcases of dirty money and the guns of the Mafia. Her screen dominance didn't stem from pure art, but was the perfect facade for the most brutal money laundering machine of the Prohibition era. Behind that untouchable feminist icon lay a dark contract where the New York underworld bought up and manipulated the entire film industry. The chaotic, financially opaque world of 1920s Broadway provided the perfect laundromat for the Mafia's radioactive bootleg cash. While traditional Wall Street investors were risk-averse and terrified of the era's powerful moral guardians, the underworld desperately needed businesses with high cash turnover and subjective production costs to clean their millions. Into this restrictive environment stepped Mae West. She was not a standard ingenue waiting to be cast by a studio executive. She was a writer, producer, and performer who understood the lucrative potential of controversy. In 1926, she wrote, produced, and starred in a play titled Simply Sex. The production bypassed the traditional sanitized romance of the era, presenting a raw, unfiltered narrative about a Montreal prostitute. It was a calculated assault on the moral sensibilities of the establishment. From a commercial standpoint, Sex was a masterclass in exploiting public curiosity. The play opened at Daly's 63rd Street Theater and immediately drew massive sold-out crowds. The public, exhausted by the hypocritical puritanism of the Prohibition era, flocked to the box office. However, the financial success of the play triggered a severe reaction from the state apparatus. The civic authorities were outraged, viewing the production not as art, but as a direct challenge to their social control. The backlash was swift and systematic. The district attorney's office, pressured by conservative lobbying groups, targeted the production. The police staged coordinated raids, shutting down performances and threatening theater owners with padlocking their venues for a year under the newly enacted Wales padlock law. The legal costs began to mount exponentially. Bail money had to be posted for the cast. Expensive defense attorneys had to be retained. And the theater lease had to be maintained even when the doors were forcibly closed by the NYPD. As legal pressure mounted and imprisonment loomed, legitimate Wall Street money vanished. The Wall Street bankers, the society investors, and the traditional Broadway producers fled. They refused to underwrite a production that was actively targeted by the district attorney. The conventional financial avenues were entirely closed to her. Without capital, the play would fold, the legal fees would bankrupt her, and her career as an independent producer would be permanently dismantled. She was isolated, financially cornered, and facing the crushing weight of the New York legal system. She did not need a traditional producer. She needed an entity that operated above the law. She needed capital that did not fear police raids, and she needed a partner whose authority superseded that of the district attorney. Because in Prohibition-era New York, there was only one institution more powerful than Broadway, the Mafia. Owney Madden enters the stage. Owney Madden was monitoring the situation with the cold detachment of a predatory investor. Born in Leeds, England, before immigrating to the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of Manhattan, Madden had built his empire on extreme, calculated violence. He earned his moniker, the Killer, during his tenure as the leader of the infamous Gopher Gang, a period during which he was implicated in multiple homicides. However, unlike many of his contemporaries who died in street wars, Madden possessed a sharp administrative intellect. Following a stint in Sing Sing prison, he returned to the streets during the height of Prohibition and transformed himself from a street-level enforcer into a sophisticated criminal executive. Madden controlled the Phoenix Brewery, operated a vast fleet of rum-running speedboats, and owned the Cotton Club in Harlem, the most famous and exclusive nightclub in the country. He controlled judges through Tammany Hall political connections and kept high-ranking police officials on a steady payroll. He was an invisible sovereign in New York, commanding an army of armed enforcers and generating staggering amounts of illicit revenue. When Madden looked at Mae West and the ensuing legal circus surrounding her play sex, he did not see a champion of free speech or a crusader for women's rights. He saw a highly visible, highly profitable commercial asset that had been temporarily distressed by a lack of funding. The box office numbers for sex were undeniable. Despite the police harassment, the public demand was insatiable. Madden recognized the fundamental economic principle that the establishment was ignoring. Controversy is free high-yield marketing. Furthermore, funding a controversial Broadway show solved a critical logistical problem for his syndicate. By injecting hundreds of thousands of dollars of bootleg cash into the production costs, inflating the expenses for sets, costumes, and marketing, the money could be washed through the theater's accounting books and returned as clean, legitimate box office profit. The convergence between the actress and the mobster was a purely pragmatic business partnership. Madden provided the massive injection of capital required to keep the production afloat, paying exorbitant legal fees and guaranteeing theater leases. In exchange, the millions generated by her ticket sales were tied to syndicate accounting ledgers. West utilized the underworld's capital to maintain her creative dominance, fully understanding the unspoken rule of her new financiers. The mob protects its investments and expects absolute financial compliance. The transition from an independent theatrical producer to a syndicate asset fundamentally altered the operational reality of Mae West's daily life. Once Madden's bootleg capital was injected into her production ledgers, the physical and logistical environment surrounding her plays was immediately restructured to meet the security protocols of the New York underworld. Madden did not rely on the New York Police Department to protect his investments, nor did he trust traditional theatrical managers to secure his revenue streams. He deployed his own infrastructure. The spaces in which West operated ceased to be mere venues for artistic expression. They became heavily fortified financial outposts for the Mafia. Beyond the glamorous publicity photographs lay a heavily militarized reality. The stage door of a Broadway theater, traditionally guarded by an elderly watchman, was now fortified by hardened syndicate soldiers. These were veterans of hijackings on the Hudson River and territorial shootouts in Hell's Kitchen. They stood in the velvet-lined lobbies wearing tailored evening clothes that concealed heavy-caliber firearms. Their presence guaranteed that the high-yield, cash-heavy enterprise remained undisturbed, a constant reminder that the box office was secured by the very men capable of executing lethal retaliation. This security apparatus extended far beyond the physical perimeter of the theater. It infiltrated the very systems designed to regulate public morality and the press. In the 1920s, theatrical critics held immense power. A scathing review from a prominent New York newspaper could close a production within a week. When West debuted productions like Sex and later The Drag, a play that openly addressed homosexuality, an entirely taboo subject at the time, the traditional press was primed to obliterate her on moral grounds. The syndicate neutralized this threat not through public relations, but through targeted intimidation. The Mafia's approach to the press was surgical. It rarely involved overt public violence, which would attract federal attention, but rather relied on the application of coercive leverage. Prominent critics and newspaper editors who planned to publish damaging editorials demanding the closure of West's plays received quiet visits from Madden's associates. These interactions often took place in the secluded booths of syndicate-owned speakeasies. The conversations were polite, heavily coded, and unmistakably threatening. The journalists were made to understand that damaging the profitability of Owney Madden's theatrical investment would be viewed as a direct attack on the syndicate's revenue. The resulting shift in media coverage was a masterclass in manipulated public discourse. Critics who had previously condemned West as a purveyor of filth suddenly adopted a tone of neutral observation or focused their reviews entirely on the sheer spectacle and box office phenomenon of the productions, carefully avoiding demands for police intervention. The Mafia effectively censored the press to protect a woman who was building a brand on defying censorship. Tammany Hall and the Machine. Managing the press, however, was only one front in the war to secure the investment. The more complex challenge was managing the state. The New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, spearheaded by the relentless John S. Sumner, possessed significant political capital. They routinely forced the district attorney to act against theatrical productions they deemed obscene. Madden could not simply assassinate civic leaders or district attorneys. He had to manipulate the judicial machinery to render their crusades ineffective. Madden achieved this through his deep symbiotic connections with Tammany Hall, the corrupt political machine that effectively governed New York City. The Irish mob and the city's political infrastructure operated in a state of mutual benefit. Madden funneled massive amounts of illicit cash into the campaign funds of Tammany politicians and provided union muscle during elections. In return, the political machine shielded his enterprises from serious legal consequences. When public pressure mounted to a point where the police were forced to raid Mae West productions, the resulting legal theater was highly choreographed. The unpredictability of the justice system was entirely removed. Before the police even arrived at the theater doors, Madden's network was activated. Bail bondsmen already retained by the syndicate were waiting at the precinct. Magistrates and judges whose positions were secured by Tammany Hall were quietly briefed on how to handle the arraignments. A police raid on a legitimate Broadway play usually meant financial ruin. The investors would panic. The theater owners would break the lease, and the production would collapse under the weight of legal fees. For a production backed by Owney Madden, a police raid was reduced to a minor scheduled operational expense. The cast would be arrested, immediately bailed out using untraceable syndicate cash, and the play would resume its schedule almost without interruption. The legal process was transformed from a punitive weapon of the state into a mild logistical inconvenience for the Mafia. The most prominent example of this manipulated justice occurred in 1927, when the authorities finally managed to secure a conviction against Mae West for obscenity related to the play Sex. She was sentenced to 10 days in the workhouse on Welfare Island. To the general public, and in the subsequent historical mythology, this event cemented her status as a martyr for free expression, a fearless artist willing to suffer incarceration for her art. Viewed through the lens of underworld logistics, however, the incarceration was a heavily managed, highly profitable public relations event. Madden's influence ensured that her time inside the penal system bore no resemblance to the standard punitive experience. West was not subjected to hard labor or the brutal conditions typical of the workhouse. Reports from the era indicate she received preferential treatment, dined with a warden, and was allowed to wear her silk undergarments rather than a prison uniform. Her 10-day sentence generated a massive amount of national press coverage. She emerged from Welfare Island not as a disgraced convict, but as a national sensation. The conviction validated her outlaw image, providing an aura of authenticity to her rebellious persona. This explosion of notoriety translated directly into skyrocketing ticket demand. The brief stint in jail, mitigated by Mafia influence, ultimately drove up the monetary value of Madden's investment exponentially. It was a calculated risk that yielded massive dividends. By the end of the 1920s, the system was perfected. The police raided the theaters, the newspapers screamed obscenity, the reformers demanded arrests. And every single scandal only increased the profits. The establishment believed it was fighting moral corruption. In reality, it was financing the greatest advertising campaign the Broadway underworld had ever seen. Diamond Lil and the Money Machine. By 1928, the financial and operational model was perfected. Mae West wrote and starred in Diamond Lil, a play that represented the absolute apex of her New York era. The narrative of the play was a thinly veiled reflection of the ecosystem she now inhabited. It centered on a tough, sexually liberated woman operating in a Bowery saloon surrounded by criminals, corrupt politicians, and white slavers. It was art imitating the exact reality that was funding the production. Diamond Lil was a staggering commercial triumph. The production values were lavish, entirely underwritten by syndicate capital. The play functioned as the ultimate money laundering mechanism. The box office took in massive amounts of legitimate cash from ticket sales, while the production's internal accounting ledgers were manipulated to wash the bootleg revenue. Phantom expenses for costume procurement, exorbitant consulting fees paid to shell companies, and inflated theater rental agreements allowed Madden to funnel illegal money into the production and extract it as clean taxable income. Broadway had evolved into something far more dangerous than entertainment. It was now a financial refinery for organized crime. Every spotlight, every ticket stub, every orchestra swell, all of it was tied to the same underground economy flooding New York with bootleg liquor, political bribes, and blood money. The psychological reality of existing within this framework required a specific type of ruthlessness on the part of Mae West. She was not a trembling, naive victim trapped in a mafia scheme. Historical consensus points to a woman possessing a brilliant, pragmatic intellect and a cold understanding of leverage. She was acutely aware of the boundaries of her autonomy within the confines of the stage. She commanded total creative control. She dictated the scripts. And she managed the comedic timing. And she crafted the sexual politics of the performance. But the moment she stepped off the stage, she existed in a space governed entirely by the brutal arithmetic of organized crime. She understood that her unprecedented artistic freedom was fundamentally contingent on her ability to generate profit for violent men. She did not seek to dismantle the patriarchy of the underworld. She sought to survive and thrive within it. She traded the unpredictable moralistic tyranny of civic reformers and traditional bankers for the predictable lethal tyranny of the Mafia. The mob demanded absolute financial compliance, but they did not care about the moral content of her art, provided it sold tickets. In this cold transactional space, West found the leverage she needed to build her empire. She recognized that in a deeply corrupt society, true independence could not be achieved through righteousness. It had to be bought. And the only men possessing enough capital and power to buy it were the men who operated outside the law entirely. The machine surrounding Mae West was no longer merely theatrical. It was industrial. The syndicate protected the investment, the politicians neutralized the courts, the newspapers softened the outrage, and the audiences kept flooding into the theaters. Because scandal had become a commodity, and Mae West had become its most profitable distributor. But while Broadway was making fortunes, America itself was beginning to collapse. And when Wall Street finally crashed in 1929, the balance of power inside the entertainment industry changed forever. Hollywood in panic. The definitive turning point in Mae West's trajectory was dictated by the catastrophic Wall Street crash of 1929. While the Great Depression evaporated legitimate wealth and bankrupted traditional investors, the shadow economy operated on a fundamentally different arithmetic. Owney Madden's underground vaults remained overflowing with untaxable bootleg cash. Recognizing that prohibition was politically unsustainable, some historians suggest the syndicates urgently needed to diversify their liquid assets into legitimate cash-heavy industries. The burgeoning yet financially desperate film industry in Hollywood presented the perfect target. By 1932, Hollywood was in a state of desperate corporate panic. The major studios had borrowed heavily from East Coast banks to finance the wildly expensive transition from silent films to sound. This technological revolution, combined with the onset of the Great Depression, had left the studio system dangerously over-leveraged. The novelty of talkies had initially sustained box office numbers. But as the economic reality of the Depression deepened, ticket sales plummeted. Paramount Pictures, one of the foundational pillars of the studio system, was on the brink of absolute financial ruin. The studio was hemorrhaging money, burdened by massive debt obligations to Wall Street banks that were themselves struggling to remain solvent. The studio executives, led by Adolf Zukor, were desperate for a guaranteed commercial hit. They needed an asset that could cut through the gloom of the Depression and command immediate, overwhelming public attention. They did not need a traditional, sanitized ingenue. They needed a proven high-yield commodity. The syndicate recognized Paramount's desperation as a point of critical vulnerability. They understood that a distressed corporation is highly susceptible to hostile negotiation. Mae West was the perfect instrument for this strategic incursion into the film industry. She had dominated the New York theatrical landscape, proving her ability to generate massive revenue through carefully managed controversy. Furthermore, the transition to sound films required actors who possessed distinct vocal delivery and a mastery of dialogue, skills that West had perfected on the Broadway stage. When the negotiations between Mae West and Paramount Pictures commenced in 1932, the studio executives operated under the assumption that they were dealing with a standard theatrical actress desperate for film work. They fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamic. In the traditional Hollywood system, the studio held absolute authority. Actors were bound by draconian 7-year contracts that dictated their salaries, their roles, their public appearances, and their personal lives. The studio owned the performer. Mae West did not enter the boardroom as a supplicant. She entered as a fully funded corporate entity backed by the implicit threat and bottomless capital of the New York underworld. The demands she placed on Paramount were unprecedented and deeply unsettling to the studio hierarchy. She refused the standard contract. She demanded absolute creative control over her dialogue, a concession that studio writers and executives fiercely guarded. She demanded a staggering weekly salary, far exceeding the standard rates for a film debutante. Most audaciously, she demanded script approval and the right to rewrite her own lines. Paramount initially balked. Such terms violated the foundational principles of the studio system. However, West possessed a strategic advantage that no other actor in Hollywood held: the power to walk away. She was not reliant on Paramount for her financial survival. If the studio refused her terms, she could simply return to New York, where Owney Madden's capital guaranteed her continued dominance of the theatrical box office. The studio, staring down the barrel of imminent bankruptcy, had no such luxury. They were forced to capitulate. The contract that brought Mae West to Hollywood was not merely an employment agreement. It was a surrender of studio sovereignty. Many historians suggest this unprecedented negotiating power stemmed directly from the financial independence she had built in New York. Unintimidated by studio executives, West operated with the cold pragmatism of someone who had survived the Broadway underworld. The migration to the West Coast was a highly calculated move. She did not arrive as a vulnerable actress, but as a sovereign brand. And Hollywood had absolutely no idea what it had just allowed through the front door. Paramount surrenders. While there is no definitive proof that hardened syndicate enforcers patrolled the Paramount backlots, Mae West navigated the studio system with a ruthless autonomy that mirrored the operational methodology of her former silent partners. Her debut film, Night After Night, in 1932, was ostensibly a vehicle for the established star George Raft. Raft himself possessed deep, well-documented ties to the New York underworld, having worked as a dancer and driver for Owney Madden and other prominent mobsters before his film career. This casting was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate alignment of syndicate-affiliated assets. West's role was initially written as a minor supporting character. Applying the leverage guaranteed by her ironclad contract, she proceeded to completely rewrite her scenes, injecting her signature dialogue and systematically dismantling the existing script to serve her own brand. Raft, understanding the hierarchy of power and recognizing the formidable force behind her, did not object to having the film stolen out from under him. The resulting performance was a revelation. West's presence on screen was electrifying, devoid of the passive victimhood that characterized most female roles of the era. She delivered her lines with the cold, assessing gaze of a woman who fully understood the transactional nature of the world around her. The film was a massive commercial success, single-handedly pulling Paramount Pictures back from the precipice of bankruptcy. The studio executives, who had initially viewed her demands as an affront to their authority, were forced to acknowledge her absolute commercial supremacy. She had delivered the salvation they desperately required. However, this salvation came with a severe structural complication. By securing her success, Paramount had inadvertently allowed an untamable asset into their meticulously controlled ecosystem. They had handed unprecedented power to a woman whose primary allegiance was not to the studio board of directors, but to the architects of the New York underworld. As West prepared for her next project, a full cinematic adaptation of her hit play Diamond Lil, which would be retitled She Done Him Wrong in 1933, The battle lines within the industry were drawn. The film would not only solidify her status as the most profitable star in the world, but it would also trigger a massive systemic reaction from the conservative political establishment. A reaction that the syndicate was already preparing to counter. She Done Him Wrong exploded into theaters like a hand grenade tossed into the middle of the Great Depression. The film was saturated with sexual innuendo, criminality, corruption, and barely disguised mockery of traditional morality. And the public loved it. Audiences packed theaters across the country to watch Mae West weaponize dialogue in ways Hollywood had never seen before. Every line dripped with implication. Every glance carried challenge. Every scene radiated a dangerous level of confidence that directly violated the carefully controlled image studios typically demanded from female stars. The movie became one of the highest-grossing productions of the year. At the exact moment America was financially collapsing, Mae West became one of the few bankable guarantees in the entire industry. Paramount's executives quietly realized something horrifying. They no longer controlled their own studio. West's films were now keeping the company alive. The salaries, the debt payments, the production schedules, the stockholders. Everything increasingly revolved around maintaining the profitability of a woman they could neither fully control nor intimidate. And Mae West knew it. She continued rewriting scripts, demanding approval over dialogue, refusing studio interference, and operating with a level of contractual authority almost unheard of during the golden age of Hollywood. The studio system was built on obedience. Mae West operated like an independent government. Meanwhile, the conservative establishment was beginning to panic. Religious groups, moral reformers, newspaper editorials, political organizations. All of them viewed Mae West as proof that Hollywood itself had become spiritually contaminated. The pressure campaign intensified. Catholic organizations condemned her films from pulpits. Editorials branded her a corrupter of American morality. Civic leaders demanded federal intervention. But every attack only increased ticket sales. Because controversy had become her greatest advertisement. The same strategy that made her a fortune on Broadway was now being weaponized on a national scale inside the American film industry. And somewhere behind the scenes, the syndicate was watching the profits roll in. Hollywood believed it had hired a controversial actress. In reality, it had entered into business with a sophisticated criminal infrastructure that understood one brutal truth better than anyone else in America. Vice sells. The Breen Office declares war. The mobilization of the American moral establishment in 1934 represented a fundamental shift in the operational environment of the Hollywood studio system, and by extension, a direct threat to the massive syndicate investments underwriting Mae West. For years, the major studios had paid mere lip service to the concept of self-censorship, treating the original 1930 production code, a set of moral guidelines drafted by Martin Quigley and Daniel A. Lord, as a public relations document rather than a binding legal framework. They ignored its directives entirely whenever it suited their financial interests, which, in the depths of the Great Depression, was constantly. Mae West's unprecedented commercial dominance was the ultimate proof that the public appetite for illicit, uncensored content far outweighed any genuine societal desire for moral instruction. However, the sheer brazenness of West's success in films like She Done Him Wrong and I'm No Angel catalyzed a reaction that neither the studio executives nor their underworld silent partners had fully anticipated. The Catholic Church, viewing the cinematic landscape as an existential threat to its cultural authority, mobilized its vast, highly disciplined congregation. In April 1934, they formed the National Legion of Decency. This was not a fringe group of isolated Puritans. It was a highly organized, aggressively managed economic weapon. The Legion demanded that millions of Catholics sign a pledge to boycott any motion picture deemed offensive to Christian morality. To the men running the studios, moral outrage was irrelevant. An economic boycott, however, was lethal. The threat of losing millions of ticket-buying customers across major urban centers of the United States, cities like Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York, where Catholic populations were heavily concentrated, was enough to send the studio boards into immediate panic. The banks holding the studio's massive debts threatened to recall their loans if the boycott materialized. Faced with total systemic collapse, the studio moguls capitulated completely. They empowered the Production Code Administration, or PCA, installing a rigid, uncompromising conservative named Joseph Breen as its absolute dictator. Breen was not a filmmaker. He was a former journalist and public relations operative acting as a ruthless corporate auditor for morality. The studios granted him the ultimate administrative weapon, the seal of approval. Effective July 1934, no film could be exhibited in any theater owned by the major studios, which constituted the vast majority of first-run cinemas in the country, without Breen's seal. To exhibit a film without it incurred a staggering $25,000 fine, a sum designed to bankrupt any independent operator foolish enough to try. For Mae West, the implementation of the Breen office was a targeted strike against her entire business model. Breen despised West, viewing her not merely as an actress, but as the physical embodiment of the industry's moral rot. When she submitted the script for her next production, initially titled It Ain't No Sin, Breen seized the opportunity to dismantle her. He rejected the script outright, demanding sweeping structural alterations to the narrative, the dialogue, and the fundamental nature of her character. He demanded the removal of all references to prostitution, illicit wealth, and sexual autonomy. At Paramount Pictures, the executive suite was paralyzed. They were caught in an impossible vice. On one side, Breen was threatening to withhold the seal, rendering their most expensive production commercially worthless. On the other side, they were dealing with Mae West, a woman who had repeatedly demonstrated her willingness to halt production and hold the studio hostage, backed by the implicit, terrifying leverage of the New York underworld. The men who survived the bootleg wars and transitioned into corporate racketeering, figures like Owney Madden, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello, were supreme pragmatists. They evaluated the new Breen office regulations not as a moral insult, but as a minor logistical hurdle in their supply chain. The syndicate understood a fundamental corporate truth: a banned film generates zero revenue. They could not simply assassinate Joseph Breen. Assassinating a highly public, federally backed moral crusader would bring the full, unmitigated wrath of the Federal Bureau of Investigation down upon their entire national infrastructure. J. Edgar Hoover was already searching for high-profile targets to justify the FBI's expanding budget. The Mafia had no intention of providing him with a martyr. Furthermore, the syndicate could not order a projectionist strike to force the film into theaters. The Legion of Decency boycott meant that even if the theaters were open, the seats would remain empty. The underworld directive to Mae West was cold, calculating, and absolute: adapt and comply, but preserve the core marketability of the asset. The mob required the cash flow to continue. They instructed her to navigate the Breen office's regulations without destroying the product entirely. She was forced to engage in a highly sophisticated game of linguistic and administrative evasion. The production of the film became a masterclass in corporate survival disguised as malicious compliance. Forced to change the title to Belle of the 90s in 1934, West weaponized her delivery. She understood that while the PCA could censor the written word, they could not easily audit a look or the intonation of her voice. She buried her subversion beneath layers of thick double entendre, mirroring the exact legal evasion tactics her silent partners used to wash illicit funds. Every line she successfully slipped past the censors was a direct preservation of underworld revenue. This methodology mirrored the exact operational tactics utilized by her criminal financiers. Just as the syndicates established legitimate front corporations to disguise illegal income, West used legitimate Breen-approved dialogue as a front to deliver illicit meaning. The Mafia appreciated this operational intelligence. She was protecting their investment by outsmarting the regulators, rather than fighting them in a feudal open war. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. The Mafia takes Hollywood. Despite Breen's relentless interference, the severe editing, and the sanitization of the plot, Belle of the 90s was another massive commercial victory. The public, fully aware of the censorship battles playing out in the press, flocked to theaters to see what Mae West had managed to slip past the moral authorities. Her ability to generate overwhelming profit under extreme regulatory pressure solidified her value to the syndicate. But it also masked a much larger, far more sinister economic shift occurring within the Hollywood infrastructure. While the Breen office focused its attention on the moral content of screenplays, the American Mafia was executing a structural takeover of the industry's financial mechanisms. The New York and Chicago syndicates had realized that investing directly in individual film productions or specific stars, even ones as profitable as Mae West, was inherently volatile. Stars aged. Public taste shifted. And as the Breen office had proven, regulatory interference could threaten box office returns at any moment. To secure permanent, risk-free revenue from Hollywood, the underworld needed to control the fundamental machinery of production and exhibition itself. They achieved this through the violent domination of labor unions, specifically the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, known as IATSE. The architect of this extortion racket was Willie Beoff, a brutal, low-level enforcer from the Chicago outfit operating under the protection of mob boss Frank Nitti. Beoff, along with his associate George Brown, whom the mob had installed as president of IATSE through widespread voter intimidation and assassination, arrived in Hollywood with a simple, terrifying mandate: bleed the studios dry. The mechanism of extortion was flawlessly designed. IATSE controlled every projectionist in the United States, and the vast majority of the technicians, carpenters, and electricians on studio lots. Beoff approached the heads of the major studios, including Nicholas Schenck at MGM, Harry Cohn at Columbia, and Adolph Zukor at Paramount, and issued a blunt ultimatum. The studios would pay the Chicago outfit an annual massive cash tribute, ranging from $50,000 to $100,000 per studio, delivered in unmarked bills. If they refused, Beoff would order a nationwide strike. The projection booths would go dark. The sound stages would shut down. And the studios would be pushed into immediate bankruptcy. The studio moguls, men who projected an image of absolute tyrannical power over actors and directors, quietly capitulated to the mob. They arranged secret meetings in hotel rooms and handed over briefcases stuffed with cash. They factored the extortion payments into their annual operating budgets, classifying them as generic legal or consulting fees. Hollywood had effectively become occupied territory. This structural extortion created a grim, deeply cynical reality for Mae West and her position within Paramount Pictures. She was the studio's primary engine of liquidity. The millions of dollars her films generated at the box office were the exact funds Paramount desperately needed to stay afloat and, crucially, to pay off Willie Beoff and the Chicago outfit. West was no longer just an actress backed by the New York mob. She was the golden goose funding the systematic extortion of her own employers by the Chicago syndicate. The more successful her films became, the tighter the mob squeezed the studios. The underworld no longer needed to negotiate individual contracts with stars like Mae West. They were now taxing the gross revenue of the entire industry itself. Every ticket sold, every spotlight switched on, every reel threaded through a projector. All of it generated tribute for organized crime. And while audiences sat in darkened theaters believing they were watching glamorous escapist entertainment during the Great Depression, they were unknowingly financing one of the largest criminal rackets in American history. Hollywood had not merely been infiltrated by the Mafia. It had been systemically absorbed. The studios still controlled the cameras, but the mob had quietly taken control of the cash register. The system turns on Mae West. With the syndicate now operating at a macroeconomic level, Mae West's value as a protected individual asset began to decline precisely as she faced a coordinated three-front institutional assault. By the time West began production on Klondike Annie in 1936, the operational pressure surrounding her had become suffocating. The Breen office, infuriated by her ability to circumvent their rulings in previous films, scrutinized every frame of the new production. Klondike Annie dealt with religious hypocrisy and identity theft, themes that explicitly violated the core tenets of the production code. Joseph Breen demanded savage cuts, stripping the film of much of its narrative coherence. Simultaneously, West faced a massive coordinated assault from William Randolph Hearst, the most powerful media baron in America. Hearst, a staunch conservative who wielded his newspaper empire as a political weapon, launched a relentless editorial crusade against West, branding her a menace to American society and demanding her removal from the screen. He explicitly forbade any of his newspapers from mentioning her name or carrying advertisements for her films. In a standard Hollywood scenario, a combined assault from the Breen office and the Hearst media empire would have resulted in the immediate destruction of an actor's career. The studio would panic, shelve the production, and terminate the contract. But Paramount could not afford to abandon Mae West. They were trapped between the crushing debt of the Depression, the extortion demands of the Chicago outfit, and their dependence on West's box office draw. Furthermore, the syndicate infrastructure that originally secured West's position had not vanished entirely. While the Chicago mob was extorting studio management at a corporate level, the New York factions that originally backed West still held significant vested interests in her commercial viability. When the Hearst boycott threatened to suppress ticket sales, underworld leverage was quietly applied to the exhibition sector. Independent theater owners operating in territories controlled by regional crime families were discreetly informed that canceling bookings for Klondike Annie due to media pressure would be interpreted as a hostile act against syndicate investments. The message was understood immediately. The film was released into a maelstrom of controversy. It was heavily censored, structurally damaged by Breen's cuts, and almost entirely blacked out by the Hearst press. Yet, despite all of this, it still generated substantial profit. The logistical force of the underworld's distribution networks, combined with West's enduring public appeal, forced the film into commercial viability. But the war of attrition was taking its toll. The constant grinding battle against the censors diluted the product. The studio system, financially exhausted by Mafia extortion and terrified of escalating political backlash, slowly began to view West not as their savior, but as an intolerable liability. Mae West, possessing a razor-sharp understanding of industry mechanics, recognized the shift immediately. She understood that the era of the untouchable independent operator inside the Hollywood system was ending. The corporate consolidation of the studios, heavily regulated by the Breen office and silently taxed by organized crime, left no room for sovereign personalities operating outside institutional control. She would either adapt or be destroyed. The fatal blow came not from police raids or moral crusaders. It came from the relentless arithmetic of the Internal Revenue Service. Federal investigators weaponized tax audits against her enormous paramount salary, threatening to expose the phantom consulting fees and dummy corporations allegedly used to siphon portions of her income through syndicate-controlled channels. The carefully maintained facade was beginning to crack. Syndicate lawyers pushed fabricated tax documents across her desk. Signing them risked federal perjury. Refusing them risked crossing organized crime. Desperate to bypass studio censorship and generate independent revenue, West attempted to pivot into network radio. In December 1937, she performed a sexually suggestive Adam and Eve sketch on a nationally broadcast NBC program. The backlash was immediate and catastrophic. Religious groups exploded with outrage, federal regulators threatened intervention, and the Federal Communications Commission warned NBC that continued association with West could jeopardize broadcasting licenses. She was effectively blacklisted from radio overnight. Paramount Pictures, already terrified of federal pressure and exhausted by years of controversy, finally moved against her. The studio invoked the morality clauses buried inside her contract, clauses she had previously ignored with near total impunity while protected by the implicit leverage of the underworld. This time, the protection was fading. The syndicate had already shifted toward far more lucrative corporate extortion rackets. Mae West was no longer essential infrastructure. She was becoming expendable. The order quietly came down, cut the losses. The underworld perimeter defense surrounding West slowly disappeared. Stripped of her studio backing, her radio platform, and much of the criminal leverage that once made executives fear her, West found herself negotiating from a position of weakness for the first time in decades. In 1939, driven largely by financial necessity and lingering contractual obligations, she signed with Universal Pictures, a second-tier studio compared to Paramount, to appear in My Little Chickadee opposite comedian W.C. Fields. The production became a monument to her declining institutional power. Without the silent threat of Mafia intervention hanging over the set, Fields openly mocked her, altered scripts to sabotage her timing, and treated her with open disdain. The woman who had once forced studio executives to surrender contracts now found herself powerless against the petty humiliations of a drunken co-star. The illusion of the untouchable sovereign had finally been shattered. Hollywood had extracted everything it needed from Mae West, and now the machine was beginning to consume her. The retreat. The strategic retreat of Mae West from the Hollywood studio system in the 1940s was not a retirement. It was a highly disciplined reallocation of capital and operational focus. Having extracted millions of dollars from an industry now firmly trapped beneath the dual suffocating pressures of federal censorship and organized crime extortion, West transitioned into something entirely different. A completely self-funded sovereign entity. She withdrew from the collapsing studio battlefield and fortified herself inside the Ravenswood apartment building overlooking Central Park. Unlike many stars of her era, West had not squandered her fortune chasing status or luxury. She invested aggressively in real estate, retained ownership over her intellectual property, and maintained strict personal control over her finances. The result was extraordinary. At a time when many former Hollywood celebrities were collapsing financially beneath tax debts, alcoholism, or fading careers, Mae West possessed a level of liquidity and independence that even the studio moguls themselves envied. The woman, originally imported to Hollywood as a highly efficient money laundering asset for the New York underworld, had effectively outmaneuvered both her criminal sponsors and her corporate employers. And the brilliance of her survival strategy became increasingly visible as the ecosystem surrounding her began violently collapsing. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, Hollywood entered a period of systemic destruction. The federal government launched aggressive antitrust lawsuits against the major studios, culminating in the 1948 Paramount Decree. The ruling forced studios to divest their massive theater chains, permanently destroying the vertically integrated monopoly that had controlled American cinema for decades. The industry plunged into financial instability. At the same time, the House Un-American Activities Committee unleashed a wave of paranoia throughout Hollywood, blacklisting writers, directors, actors, and producers suspected of communist affiliations. Fear consumed the industry. Careers evaporated overnight. The same studio system that once projected an image of total invincibility now resembled a corporate war zone. Meanwhile, the underworld operators who had silently taxed Hollywood for years met far uglier fates. The Chicago outfit's IATSE extortion racket, the operation that siphoned millions from the studios through union corruption, was finally exposed by federal investigators. Willie Beoff, the brutal enforcer who had terrorized studio executives into handing over briefcases of cash, turned state's evidence in an attempt to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. In the arithmetic of organized crime, cooperation with federal authorities is an unforgivable offense. There are no retirement plans for informants. In November 1955, Beoff started the engine of his pickup truck in Phoenix, Arizona. A massive dynamite bomb wired to the ignition detonated instantly. He was obliterated. Frank Nitti, the Chicago outfit boss who had overseen much of the Hollywood extortion structure, had already committed suicide years earlier rather than face federal indictment. The studio moguls fared little better. Louis B. Mayer was eventually forced out of MGM during a ruthless corporate coup. Harry Cohn died, hated and feared. And the men who once treated Hollywood like a private kingdom slowly watched their empire fracture apart beneath lawsuits, federal investigations, labor wars, and television competition. Mae West observed all of it from the penthouse of the Ravenswood. Completely insulated. She had not signed a traditional studio contract in years. And unlike many of her contemporaries, she had never cooperated with federal investigators regarding her early financial backing. She adhered strictly to the code of silence she had learned from Owney Madden. You do not speak to the authorities about the men who funded your ascent. By the mid-1940s, after allowing the Hollywood machine to consume itself, West began carefully reactivating her career, but entirely on her own terms. In 1944, she returned to the stage with Catherine Was Great, a lavish and highly sexualized interpretation of Catherine the Great of Russia. But the operational mechanics surrounding the production were radically different from her Broadway years. She no longer required bootleg capital to finance theater leases. She no longer needed syndicate intimidation to manage the press. Mae West had become her own bank. She possessed the liquidity to fully self-finance productions, assume total financial risk, and retain complete ownership over the profits. And she applied the lessons learned from both organized crime and the Hollywood studio system with ruthless efficiency. She maintained strict control over casting, lighting, marketing, accounting, tour scheduling, and revenue distribution. Every aspect of the operation flowed through her authority. She had studied the machinery of power from the inside, and now she was replicating it independently. As the 1950s approached, organized crime established a new glittering capital in the Nevada desert, Las Vegas. The city was built by the precise demographic of men who had financed West's early career, figures like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, utilizing Teamsters pension loans, casino skimming operations, and underworld financing structures to construct luxury casino resorts, far beyond the reach of traditional moral regulation. Las Vegas was the spiritual successor to Prohibition-era Broadway, an unregulated paradise of vice, gambling, sexuality, and spectacle. A city operating almost entirely outside the moral jurisdiction that once attempted to crush Mae West. It was the perfect ecosystem for her brand. In 1954, West debuted a nightclub act at the Sahara Hotel in Las Vegas, and the mechanics of the engagement were deeply revealing. Casino management, fully aware of her historical connections to organized crime, treated her with a level of deference rarely afforded to entertainers. She was not viewed as an employee. She was treated like a surviving architect of the old system. Her performances became a masterclass in psychological dominance and brand preservation. Surrounded by heavily muscled male bodybuilders, West inverted the traditional Hollywood power structure. For decades, women had been objectified for male audiences. Mae West flipped the equation entirely. She commodified the male physique and transformed masculinity itself into spectacle. The act became one of the highest-grossing nightclub attractions in Las Vegas. Once again, she adapted before the culture fully understood what she was doing. She had successfully evolved from Broadway provocateur to Hollywood sovereign to fully independent corporate entity. And unlike most of the men who helped build the empire surrounding her, she survived long enough to enjoy the profits. The last empress of Hollywood. The architect of Mae West's original ascent, Owney Madden, was simultaneously executing one of the most extraordinary endgames in the history of American organized crime. Madden remains a historical anomaly. A high-ranking, lethally violent mob boss who managed to retire without being assassinated or sentenced to life in federal prison. After leaving New York, he relocated to Hot Springs, Arkansas, a deeply corrupt municipality that functioned as a protected sanctuary for gambling, bootlegging, and political corruption. Operating beneath layers of civic protection, Madden quietly managed illegal wire services, gambling operations, and financial networks, while cultivating the image of a wealthy local businessman and philanthropist. He died quietly of emphysema in 1965 at the age of 73. No prison execution. No gangland assassination. No public downfall. Just a silent exit. The parallel between Madden and Mae West is impossible to ignore. Both possessed a cold, unsentimental understanding of leverage. Both recognized that power is temporary. And both understood that survival depends entirely on knowing when to retreat, consolidate assets, and disappear from the battlefield before the system collapses around you. Neither succumbed to the fatal ego that destroyed so many of their contemporaries. They treated life as a tactical operation, and both successfully executed their extraction plans. By the late 1960s, however, the cultural landscape of the United States underwent a violent transformation. The restrictive moral codes that had defined American entertainment for decades finally collapsed beneath the pressure of the sexual revolution, counterculture movements, and changing public attitudes. In 1968, the Hollywood Production Code, the same censorship system that spent decades attempting to dismantle Mae West, was officially abolished and replaced by the modern age-based rating system. The censors were finally dead. And in a darkly ironic twist of history, American culture had finally caught up to the operational reality Mae West had established nearly 40 years earlier. Only after the censorship apparatus collapsed did West decide to return to cinema. In 1970, at the age of 77, she agreed to appear in Myra Breckinridge, an adaptation of Gore Vidal's sexually explicit satirical novel. Her motivation was not financial. By that point, her real estate empire had rendered her effectively immune to monetary pressure. The film was something else entirely, an exercise in ego, a demonstration of dominance, a final reminder that she still possessed the ability to bend major studios around her will. And on the set of Myra Breckinridge, she behaved exactly like someone who had spent a lifetime surviving gangsters, studio moguls, federal regulators, and moral crusaders. She demanded total control over her dialogue. Ignored directorial authority. Willie Byoff was blown apart by a car bomb. Frank Nitti killed himself. The studio moguls lost their empires. The production code collapsed. And the Hollywood system that once believed itself untouchable slowly cannibalized itself through greed, censorship, paranoia, and corruption. Mae West watched it all happen from behind the walls of the Ravenswood. Still wealthy, still protected, still in control of her own name. That is the real lesson hidden beneath the mythology. She did not destroy the system. She learned how to survive inside it long enough to escape before it collapsed. And in the brutal arithmetic of the 20th century, that may have been the greatest victory of all. Because the truth is uncomfortable. To break the rules of the establishment without being crushed, you often needed protection from forces even darker than the establishment itself. Mae West understood that reality earlier than most. She partnered with monsters, absorbed their tactics, washed their money, and ensured that when the era finally ended, she was the only one left holding the winnings. The cameras stopped rolling, the censors disappeared, the gangsters died, the empires crumbled. But the legend survived. And somewhere beneath all the polished Hollywood mythology, the ghost of the underworld still lingers behind the spotlight. The story of Mae West is not a clean Hollywood fairy tale. It is a story about systems. Systems of money. Systems of corruption. Systems of influence. And the brutal machinery hiding underneath the golden age of American entertainment. Hollywood loves to package history into simple narratives. The rebellious artist. The evil censor. The triumphant icon. Reality is never that neat. The real story is that the entertainment industry matured during one of the most corrupt periods in American history. An era where organized crime, political machines, Wall Street speculation, media manipulation, and moral crusaders all collided inside the same collapsing economic landscape. Mae West simply understood the rules faster than everyone else. She recognized that morality was negotiable, power was transactional, and survival depended on leverage. She did not defeat the machine. She learned how to operate inside it without allowing it to consume her entirely. That alone made her different from almost everyone surrounding her. The gangsters built empires and died violently. The studio executives built monopolies and lost them. The censors spent decades policing morality only to watch the culture abandon them completely. But Mae West adapted. Again. And again. And again. Broadway. Hollywood. Radio. Las Vegas. Stage tours. Real estate. Every time the environment changed, she repositioned herself before the collapse arrived. That is why she survived while so many others vanished. Because beneath the diamonds, the jokes, the glamour, and the innuendo, Mae West thought like a strategist. And whether people want to admit it or not, that mindset was forged in an environment dominated by organized crime, financial manipulation, and institutional hypocrisy. The official version of Hollywood history prefers clean legends. But the real history is covered in cigar smoke, bootleg cash, political favors, extortion payments, and sealed accounting ledgers. And somewhere in the center of that entire machine stood Mae West, smiling directly at the camera while the empire behind her quietly counted the money. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to Pizzaverse Studios for more deep dives into the hidden machinery behind Hollywood, organized crime, political corruption, propaganda, censorship, media manipulation, and the stories polite society usually buries beneath official mythology. Because around here, we don't rewrite history, we excavate it. Welcome to the Pizzaverse Social Club. To everybody watching tonight, thank you for supporting independent storytelling, independent research, and independent creators willing to explore the uncomfortable corners of history. This channel exists because of you. Every comment, every view, every late-night conversation, every person willing to sit through these long, strange journeys into the machinery behind the myths. We appreciate all of it more than you know. Whether you've been here since day one or you just found this little digital social club tonight, thank you for spending your time with us. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And remember, the official story is usually the cleaned-up version. Good night, everybody. Mae West, the queen of weaponized innuendo, built an empire by smiling directly into the face of censorship and basically saying, "Yeah, cry harder." Half Hollywood icon, half corporate warlord in diamonds. Owney Madden. Prohibition gangster, bootleg king, nightclub owner, and apparently Broadway's least ethical venture capitalist. Looked at censorship scandals and saw strong quarterly growth. George Raft. Hollywood actor with enough underworld connections to make studio executives nervous during lunch meetings. Basically walked into movies already sounding like he knew where bodies were buried. Joseph Breen. The human embodiment of absolutely not. Spent the 1930s trying to stop Americans from seeing cleavage, flirting, and happiness. William Randolph Hearst. Media emperor, professional grudge holder, and living proof that billionaires being petty is not a modern invention. Willie Beoff. The guy who figured out you don't need to own Hollywood if you can just threaten to shut off the projectors. Very entrepreneurial, extremely illegal. Frank Nitti. Chicago outfit boss. Managed Hollywood labor extortion like it was a Fortune 500 side hustle. Meir Lansky. Le Baccountant extraordinaire. If organized crime had a CFO division, this guy had Employee of the Month parking for life. Bugsy Siegel. A gangster who looked at the Nevada desert and said, "You know what this place needs? Gambling, neon, and financial crimes." Well, you see Fields. Talented comedian, professional alcoholic, and the human equivalent of a whiskey bottle insulting you from across the room. Raquel Welch. Walked into a late career Mae West production and immediately discovered there was only room for one empress in the building. J. Edgar Hoover. spent decades hunting gangsters while also somehow turning the FBI into the most paranoid office building in America. A true multitasker.
They call it sugar. But let's be honest. This isn't sweet. It's temptation. Welcome to Bambi's Sugar Syndicate, where chocolate is rich, the flavors linger, and every bite feels a little forbidden. Slow crafted, small batch, infused with espresso, velvet cocoa, and bold indulgence. This isn't candy you rush. This is candy you surrender to. One taste. And suddenly, you're breaking your own rules. No shortcuts. No apologies. Just luxury, done dangerously right. Bambi's Sugar Syndicate. Luxury candy. Criminally good. Go ahead. You deserve it.
Yeah, I done did a lot of things in my day, I admit it, I don't take back what I say. If I said it, then I meant it. All my life I won a Grammy, but I probably never get it. I ain't never had no trophy or no motherfucking ribbon. Fuck the system, I'm that nigga, bend the law, cut the rules. I'm about to risk it all, I ain't got too much to lose. Y'all been eating long enough, it's my turn to cut the food. Pass the plate, with my drink, this my day. Lucky you, fuck you too, woo! Y'all gotta move, y'all gotta move. Gotta move, give me some room, give me some room, give me the juice. How about the coupe? How about the coupe? How about the shoot? Y'all gotta move, y'all gotta move, give me the juice. Back on my bullshit, my back to the wall, turn my back on you, all of you finished. Back to these bullets, it's back to the job, put my Mac out and all of you running. Back on my hood shit, it's back to the pushing, these taxing, I'm actually pumping. Can't fuck with you rappers, you practically sucking. You might have went platinum, but that don't mean nothing. I'm actually buzzing this time. Straight out the kitchen, I told him the oven is mine. I do not fuck with you guys. If I don't kill you, just know you gon' suffer this time. I ain't no gangster, but I got some bangers, some chains and some blazing, a couple of nines. Choppers and jimmies, a partridge, a petri. My 20s and Christmas was nothing but lies. I run at you hot like a sumo. They say I talk like a chulo. I live in Mars, I'm not Bruno. Bitch, I'm a duck, call me Cujo. You play your cards, I reverse on you all, and I might just drop all like a Uno. Cállate boca, my home, they call it Obuto, and all of you culo. Step the better to level up in the ghetto, looking for something I probably can never find now. Shit get relevant till the beat die down. The truth niggas just really want me tied down. I've been alone and I never needed nobody, just only me and my shotty. I tell these niggas to lie down. Keep all the money, I never wanted a lifestyle, but I pray to God my son to be all right now. I said ain't no love for the other side or anyone who ever wants smoke. When I die, I'm going out as the underdog who never lost hope. You in the wrong cab, down the wrong path, nigga, wrong way, wrong road. Snakes in the grass, trying to slither fast. I just bought a fucking lawnmower.
I said a lot of things in my day. I admit it, this is payback in a way. I regret it that I did it. I done won a couple Grammys, but I sold my soul to get them. Wasn't in it for the trophies, just the fucking recognition. Fuck's the difference, I'm that cracker, been the law. Fuck the rules, man, I used to risk it all. Now I got too much to lose. I've been eating long enough, man, my stomach should be full. I just ate, lick the plate, my buffet. Lucky me, fuck you think. Woo! I got a couple of mentions, still I don't have any manners. You got a couple of ghostwriters, but to these kids it don't actually matter. They're asking me what the fuck happened to hip-hop. I said I don't have any answers, cause I took a nap when I dropped my last album. It hurt me like hell, but I'm back on these rappers. And actually coming from humble beginnings, I'm somewhat uncomfortable winning. I wish I could say what a wonderful feeling. We're on the upswing like we're punching the ceiling, but nothing is feeling like anyone has any fucking ability to even stick to a subject. Is killing me, the inability to pin humility. Why don't we make a bunch of fucking songs about nothing and mumble and bucket? I'm going for the juggler, shit is a circus. You clowns that are coming up, don't give an ounce of a motherfucker about the ones who were here before you that made rap. Let's recap, way back, and tease that. Recap on tape decks, 8 dats with a G-raps. Came that, we need 3 stacks, ASAP, and bring that, the ace back, cause tap for these rappers have brain damage. On a lean rapping, face tats syrupped out like tree sap. I don't hate trap, and I don't wanna seem mad, but in fact, what I owe me at the same cat that would take that feedback and aim back. I need that, but I think it's it's inevitable. They know a button to press it will ever the pull to give me the snap though. And if I paid attention, I'm probably making it bigger, but you been taking your dicks on a fucking backhoe. On the freaking minute, got me thinking of finishing everything with a seed of minutes and reaping the benefits. I'm asleep at the wheel again as I'm thinking about an evil intent of another beat. I'm a kill again. Cause even if I got it in a beating, a pill again, even ketamine and methamphetamine with a mini tin, it better be at least 70 or 300 milligram. And I might as well, cause I'ma end up being a villain again. Levels to this shit, I got an elevator. You could never say to me, I'm not a fucking record breaker. I sound like a broken record every time I break a record. Nobody could ever take away the legacy I made. A navigator, motherfucker, never got a right to be this way. I got spikes inside my DNA, but I roll till the wheels fall off. I'm working tirelessly, ayy. It's the moment y'all been waiting for, like California wishing rain to pour, and that drought y'all been praying for. My downfall, from the 8 Mile to the South Pass to the same marshal, that outlaw that they say is a rider might have fell off. I'm back on that bull like the cowboy. So y'all gotta move, yeah, y'all gotta move, yeah,
I gotta move, give me some room, give me some room, give me the juice. How about the coupe? How about the coupe?